ज्ञान और भारतीय भाषा केंद्र के द्वारा आयोजित इस 10 दिवसीय कार्यशाला के तीसरे दिन के दूसरे सत्र में इस सभागार में एक बार फिर से चाय के बाद आप सबका हार्दिक अभिनंदन करता हूं। और अभी हम सब मैडम प्रोफेसर अलेसांद्रा जी से सुनेंगे ट्रांसलेशन एंड इंडियन कल्चर एंड ट्रांसलेशन। आप ध्यान दें कि नुक्ता के हेर फेर से खुदा जुदा भी हो जाते हैं, तो ये एंड की जगह इन रहा होता। अनुवाद में भारतीय संस्कृति और अनुवाद, भारतीय संस्कृति में अनुवाद, तो ये जो जिसको प्रीपोजिशन कहते हैं अंग्रेजी में, हिंदी में वो कारक की कई विभक्तियां हैं। तो ये कारक विभक्तियों के भेद से अर्थ किस तरह भेद उत्पन्न करते हैं, और लगातार आप लोग 3 दिनों से प्रोफेसर अलेसांद्रा जी को सुन रहे हैं। और जैसा कि हम सब इस बात से मुतमईन हैं कि इन 3 दिनों के आयोजनों में प्रोफेसर अलेसांद्रा जी ने हम सब को और भारत में अनुवाद की परंपरा को और भारतीय भाषा केंद्र JNU में संचालित अनुवाद अध्ययन ज्ञान शाखा को बहुत समृद्ध किया है। हम आप सब की तरफ से, भारतीय भाषा केंद्र परिवार की तरफ से, JNU परिवार की तरफ से प्रोफेसर अलेसांद्रा जी का हार्दिक अभिनंदन करते हैं और हमें इस तरह समृद्ध करने के लिए इनके प्रति आभार व्यक्त करते हैं। अभी हम सुने भारतीय संस्कृति और अनुवाद, प्रोफेसर अलेसांद्रा जी।
ओह सॉरी, ठीक है। तो अच्छा, फिर से नमस्ते, जोहार, सलाम अलैकुम, सत श्री अकाल, और thank you for being here for the 3rd day. I don't know if you will survive, but I hope so. Actually, Naveen ji pointed out something very interesting, that the title of this talk can be modified in different ways, but in any case it is regarding India, Bharat, or Anuvad. या अनुवाद इंडिया, मतलब
मैंने ये कहा कि ये एक जो बीच में,
हाँ बीच में, हाँ
इसको यदि बदल देंगे,
हाँ
अर्थ कितना बदलेगा।
लेकिन मतलब हम इसको रखेंगे, लेकिन जो अर्थ है हम मॉडिफाई कर सकेंगे। तो क्योंकि मैंने सोचा था कि इस क्लास के लिए थोड़ा सा ज्यादा समय हो, क्योंकि सिलेबस में ये लिखा हुआ था कि समय अलग हो, लेकिन तो मैंने सोचा कि ओके, वी विल ट्राई टू डिफाइन translation again. We did it in the first time, and then I wanted to talk about intra-Indian translations and multilingualism. So in this case, we are talking about the culture of translation within India and among Indian languages. And then, the relation between English and local languages, so Orientalism and after, and I would like to, see what's happening also today. I would like to bring a case. So why is the Padmavat so problematic? And I don't know, you probably, I hope everybody knows what Padmavat is. If you have never heard about it, which is very strange, but anyway, I will just try to talk about that. And then I wanted also to talk about the institutionalization of translation in India and the problem of translation and regarding Indian translations of Indian works of Indian novels, for example, into English nowadays, and what it means to be recognized at an international level. And this I can do because, I have translated it to Italian, a very famous novel. So everybody is like saying, oh my God, you translated it. Yes, I did. So, and it's really like, I could perceive what this means. You have an English translation and you are seen. So these are the points that I wanted to talk about. I don't know if we will have time to do all of that, but okay, I will just try to start with the first one. We go back to the definition of translation, and okay, the first day also we had a definition, in the previous session, so we are not spending too much time of that. Okay. In Hindi, and I'm using Hindi because this is the only Indian language that I know, that I studied. So it's Anuvad. And Anuvad is, okay, if you look at the dictionary, it is translated as translation. But at synonymous, you have Bhashantar, you have Tarjuma, and Anuvad is a Sanskrit word that comes from Anu, that is like, this prefix that means trans, going after also with along across, and Vad, which is like, speaking the word and so on. And I found out that there are many other Indian languages that use some words that are very similar. I don't know any of them, so I took, what was written on the dictionary as something that is true. If you have any problem, just point it out to me. What is important is that if we go back to the meaning that we find in the Sanskrit dictionary, it's saying after, saying again, it's repeating. So we had spoken about, the translation as something that transfers, that brings something across. So, and here we have a sort of different meaning. So there is this idea of commenting on, repeating, saying after somebody has said. It's interesting that in some of the let's say distant meanings are also abuse and tautology, which is like repetition, which is okay, but tautology has a negative meaning because it means repeating something that is not needed, so and the conformity. So translation has all these different meanings. Avadesh Kumar Singh, in one of his papers, in one of his essays, writes that Anuvad was a knowledge transmission and a pedagogical strategy of Indian tradition. And he refers to the Guru Shishya tradition, saying that what comes after, so the disciple repeating what the Guru said, this is, the real meaning of translation. That's why it is like, a pedagogical strategy. And he defines it as an inclusive, comprehensive, and non-hierarchical, unfettered by linguistic transference, and it includes recitation, restatement, commentaries, and interpretation. If you remember what I said in my first class, I was asking, can we consider this translation? Well, according to Avadesh Kumar Singh, if we think of Anuvad, we should say yes, all this is translation, okay, in the Indian context, of course. So we also have Tarjuma, and Tarjuma is like borrowed from Persian. Again, here we have a name that apparently I found has entered many Indian languages. So I assume that it's, another important word for translation. And it's interesting because, the first one comes from Sanskrit and this one comes from Persian. So here again, we can see that we have this like double heritage, to describe a phenomenon. Then, of course, we also have Bhashantar, and this is really like changing the language, and we can use it as linguistic transference, which is transfer from one language to the other. And here we go back to the first meaning of, translatio, you bring one meaning to the other. But Avdesh Kumar Singh proposes also other names. I don't want to spend too much time with that. I just want to point out that, of course, if we want to claim that the Indian tradition is different, then we have some reasons to do it. If we want to claim that, okay, we are talking about the same thing, we have some reasons to do it. It depends on, our aim. So I went to the notion of Rupantar, which is like, changing the form. And it's like metamorphosis. And if you remember, metamorphosis is something that I mentioned also when we went back to the Greek meaning, which is related, to say after, to change the form. And this is interesting because in the idea of Rupantar, we really have the changing of the form, but it's also the notion of semiotic transference, semiotic appropriation. And so it's really like, you can consider as translation also, for example, Harry Potter in Hindi subtitles or something like that, or, when you make a film out of a novel. So this is Rupantar. So, and if they are synonymous, and we know that synonymous are not exactly the same thing, but after this definition, I would like to just go into the idea of what happened in India about translation, because for a long time it was told that because Anuvad is something different from translation, so there is nothing like translation in India in the old times. And so, actually, we can think of the multilingual situation in India, where you have like languages of prestige, languages of classical languages, let's call like them, languages of power. And of course, if we think of the old times, we can think of Sanskrit and Tamil, for example. We can think of Persian and Arabic for some time. We can think also of English, but also within Indian languages, as we just heard in the previous session, there are different levels, so some languages are a bigger fish than other languages. And so, this has always been there. Of course, we have different degrees to access to different languages, and we have the notion of bhasha at a certain point, which is generally translated as vernacular languages. That was how the English, during the British time, it was translated. And even nowadays, it's like, oh, this was written in vernacular. So, but under, the label bhasha, what do we have? It's not one language. Bhasha can mean, okay, it's language. But what we mean, it's different kind of vernaculars that are tailored to different workplaces, to different arenas, to different audiences. And of course, even the elite languages, like Sanskrit, Persian, Arabic, they had different levels according to, okay, they were language of an elite, but not all the elites were the same. So even when we think of all this complexity, we should keep in mind that a text, can pass through languages, but can also be translated in multiple styles and multiple forms, Rupantar, even if it's within one language. So this is something that, is always been present, because if you think of, literary texts passing from one language to the other, maybe we don't find an evidence of translation, like somebody was very keen on the notion of equivalence, the same word to word, the same, even the dynamic equivalence, of a text. But if we think of this wider idea of, Anuvad and Rupantar, then the Jataka, they have many different manifestations, and even in between Sanskrit and Tamil, we have some text. I'm not an expert neither in Sanskrit nor in Tamil, but I mean, I found, this, and I spoke to some colleagues of mine, that, for example, when you have like texts that talk about drama, and there are really, some contiguities that it's not a translation, but it's like, the same idea or in a different way. And also, for example, if we think of the dissemination of bhakti, I think Navinji is going to talk about that, so I'm not delving on this topic, but I mean, what do we do with the similarities that we find between texts that are from the south in Tamil and from the north in Bengal, and of course it's not a translation, but somehow these wandering mistress that traveled in India, they were probably not translating in the text in the sense that they had a written text when translating it, but they were translating And, this is another very important thing that has always been there. So very often I think when I read about, translation in India, that this is stressed as, a peculiarity of, the Indian culture. So you have a question?
I just had a point that wouldn't it be appropriation then? The dissemination of idea itself as an appropriation. They're appropriating each other's ideas.
Okay, but if we accept the notion of Rupantar, that's the point, yeah.
रूपांतर के लिए हिंदी में शब्द है एडाप्टेशन के लिए रूपांतर,
वो भी है,
और एप्रोप्रिएशन के लिए आत्मसातीकरण। जैसे रामचरितमानस तो रामायण का वह आत्मसातीकरण, एप्रोप्रिएशन और डोमेस्टिकेशन, जिसको वहां तो पलटूकरण कहा गया, पर वो घरेलूकरण। लेकिन ये घरेलूकरण भी थोड़ा ठीक ठाक नहीं लगता है शब्द हिंदी में। इसका आत्मसातीकरण, वो उस समय में 16वीं शताब्दी का जो भारत था, उस संस्कृति में 7वीं शताब्दी में वाल्मीकि द्वारा लिखी गई चीज को आत्मसातीकरण, एप्रोप्रिएट करके उस समय के समाज को देखते हुए जैसे राम जैसी सीता की जरूरत थी वैसा उन्होंने रखा। यहीं पर संतुलिता सिद्धांत भी थोड़ा फेल होता है कि 16वीं शताब्दी के भारत को 7वीं शताब्दी के राम की जरूरत नहीं।
जी।
वहाँ 16वीं शताब्दी का राम चाहिए जो मर्यादा पुरुषोत्तम नहीं हो सकते।
And this is interesting because if we think of translation as, this like also as performance, I'm coming to this, for example. Of course, I was going to mention, the different adaptation or appropriation or translation or call them, I mean...
even in Sanskrit, in Panchatantra, source of extant text is in Paishachi. So far we have not found the Sanskrit text.
Source is Paishachi, not Paishachi. You are talking about Brihat Katha.
Brihat Katha is in Paishachi. So, yes.
It was earlier in Paishachi.
And it was appropriated.
Paishachi, not Paishachi, Pingal. वो मुनि को असल में कहा गया कि इस राज्य वो वहाँ घटना इससे बनी कि कौन सिखा देगा संस्कृत इसको। तो जो वहाँ के राज पंडित थे उनको जब बुलाया गया, उन्होंने कहा गुनाजी ने कहा कि संस्कृत ऐसी भाषा नहीं है कि ये सप्ताह भर में या 6 महीने में सीख जाए, तो उनको निकाल दिया। अपमान बोध से वे जब जंगल गए तो वहाँ खून से उन्होंने जानवरों के चमड़े पर लिखना शुरू किया, और फिर ये सब कथा है। और जब ये हुआ कि अब क्या करें, तो उसको गुनाजी ने सुनाना शुरू किया, और जब सुनाया गया तो सुना के एक एक पाठ सुनाते थे और उसको आग में डालते जाते थे, वो जलता चला गया। और सुनने वाले सारे पशु पक्षी थे। वे कथा जब वो सुना रहे थे तो जो पशु पक्षी वहां आते थे वो भूख से वहां से निकलते नहीं थे, तो वो मरने लगे धीरे धीरे। इधर राजा के यहाँ मांसाहार के लिए पशुओं की कमी होने लगी, तब राजा ने जब खोज की तो फिर उस पंडित को पकड़ के लाया गया और तब वो टिंगल से फिर वापस संस्कृत किया गया। ये है तो वो ये पंचतंत्र तो विष्णु शर्मा द्वारा लिखा हुआ, अमर सिंह के राज में हो रहा है, हुआ।
I'm very grateful for your contribution, but I don't want to delve into these kind of problems. My point is different. You know, my point is not to show who was the first one and where it comes from. What is... नहीं, ये ठीक है. This is a very important issue, but today my point is to try to see this, let's say, translational culture that, you know, has been described somehow in different ages. And regarding, we can see that there was something that we can define as translation, maybe not in the idea that Jacobson gave to us, you know, it's or in the line of Anuvad Rupantar, so and okay, but it was there. And what is important, I mean, my point is that this sort of process, you know, what we can call translation in a wide sense, you know, transferring this katha, these stories from, you know, one language to the other, at a certain point became very important because they promoted the standardization of what we can call Indo-Aryan languages, or, you know, modern languages. And so we can see that this idea of translating texts, because yes, I spoke about, for example, these wandering people, you know, going around and singing, but there was also a written tradition. And so this written tradition linked to the transmission of, for example, Katha or Ram Katha or whatever, it was there. And so, of course, there are modifications, we can call them adaptation, we can do this. But if the notion of translation is the one that we have defined at the beginning of our talk, then we can see that it was there. And what is relevant is that, you know, it influenced also the standardization of the so-called vernaculars. I don't know if we agree on that, but I think this is a very relevant point. And so translation is, yes, rewording, so saying it after, you know, saying it in a different way, maybe giving also a commentary, or, you know, just explaining, because this is what we said, this is what Anuvad is. It's also changing the script. And we can see this in the different manuscripts, you know, because this was the standard procedure for, you know, communicating text to different audiences. You know, you could change the wording or the script. And for example, sometimes we have two manuscripts, they seem to be the same text in the same script, but they are meant to be read by different people in different instances, and they will have a different reception. I'll give you an example that if we see the same text, I mean, this is not the same text, but I mean, I just, you know, put some images. The same text in an inscription over a miniature painting, or the same words in a singer's handbook with some kind of marks that are meant for this oral mediation by the performer. And, you know, the performers, of course, they could modify the inflection, the words, according to the audience they were talking to. So it is the same text. But what we have in the reception, you know, it's different. So, and this is also, we can call it maybe a, I don't know, a kind of translation. And if you think of, for example, performers that are actors or, you know, singers, maybe they can also stop. They have the text and they are telling the text, but they can stop, insert some improvisation and elaboration, explanations for the audience in the passages that they think, they are not very clear, or, maybe they think that it's good to give an explanation. Yesterday, we got, a speaker who was really in favor of explanation into the translation. So it's more or less the same. It's like you don't put a footnote, you are talking and you explain the text. So this is the kind of translation that we find if, my colleagues who are really studying the scripts, they are really, bringing out this idea of, translation as something different from, the notion that maybe we can have if we stick to the definition by Gibson. And at that time, so the concept of an original text that has a high status, which is the reason why some important. So in this context, this is not important at all. It was not so relevant. It's something that came much later, and in the so-called medieval age, what Bastantri defined as the phantasm of equivalence was not there. So that's why, if we don't have the problem of equivalence, then we can accept a notion, a much wider notion of translation. And this is what historically seems to be there, So and of course, in this context, the notion of the author becomes debatable, because the notion of you have to get Shakespeare and the author with capital A was something that comes much later. But so in this field of translation, of course, I mentioned this intra-lingual translation, between intra-Indian translation among the so-called vernaculars. We also have translation from Sanskrit into other, let's say, prestige languages like Arabic and Persian. And of course, this was a sort of specialized kind of translation that went on for many years. It was also present in you probably know better than I do, during the colonial time. And of course, it was special kind of text, because it was like practical arts, science, political works, metaphysical and mystical treatises. And when the Britishers came, they commissioned also, some translations of works on Hindu religion and law. And this is very crucial, because, the idea that the Britishers had created about, the Indian context, and we just spoke about, you're talking about India, and so everybody in India is if you are a Hindu, you are like this, if you are like, I don't know, we just learned about other languages, even in small languages, maybe from one village to the other, you have differences and maybe also local variations, like crystallized. So I would like to move to the relationship between English and the local languages. I will be very brief, because, of course, here you have a huge literature about that. And it's interesting that there is a difference between what happened during the so-called British Orientalism phase, that is from the end of the 18th century to mid-19th century. And in this time, of course, we have, I think everybody is acquainted to the notion of Orientalism that was proposed by Said. But when we say Orientalism in this sense, it's a different kind of Orientalism. It's really like, people who wanted to learn about what they defined as the Orient. And of course, in this process, there is also the process of self-definition, both for the English and also for the Indian people, because we know that out of this process of Orientalism, then, you know, we have some notions like nationalism that are produced later. But it's interesting because in the first phase, what they wanted to see was like finding an account or an authentic account of what India is. And I think the first Orientalists were really sincerely interested in, you know, knowing this culture. And they, of course, their mistake was that they imagined that as a monolithic culture. But anyway, it was like, but then after I would say that a more political comes into and because when English became the language of administration, and I don't have to quote Macaulay to you because I think everybody has heard, you know, about brown people, you know, but that are really English inside. And so this, of course, changed things. You know, after this process, what happens is that, you know, more Indian people, educated Indian people acquire English proficiency, and of course, there is an effort to translate English books into local languages, which was promoted by the Britishers themselves because they thought that, you know, it was a way to promote English literature. But after some time, this has a side effect. And because, you know, we have the notion that, you know, for example, the Bengali Babu at that time would be somebody, you know, just sitting there and, you know, collaborating with the Britishers. But the more educated people were there, the more this knowledge of English and translating into English and from English became like a strategy to elaborate different kinds of ideas and of explaining what we are. You know, like finding a way to define also their own identity. For the Britishers, though, these kind of translations were a means to study what they called the Hindu psyche. I mean, their idea was like that. And the idea is that, of course, I mean, they had to translate because they had to, it's like, you know, this is why, for example, Sanskrit was discovered, you know. Sanskrit is the key to understand the Hindu psyche. And, of course, it's a discovery that the Britishers claim to have done. I mean, of course, we are in this Orientalistic attitude. What is interesting is that when the first translations into English of the Sanskrit books, of the Sanskrit, let's say, classic books that were identified as the authentic texts in order to understand the Hindu psyche, when this happened, this had an effect also on the text itself, because the first translation that is really interested is a book of law, that is a code of gentoo laws of ordination of the Pandits. And it's interesting that they pick up an old text regarding laws and they describe it as the textbook of laws for the people in India. But what is even more interesting is that the translation of a Bhagavad Gita that was done in 1784 into English, of course, it brought Bhagavad Gita into the international stage. But it had a side effect also in India, because starting from that very translation, in India, people started to see that, oh, come on, if they are translating this text, it must be a very important text. And this is a text that contains the very value and culture of that we are. And so even the Indian audiences let's say, that accepted this text in the canon of their own texts. And we can see that it came to be used as a text that was very useful for self-definition. And we can see how Tilak and Gandhi himself, they used the Gita. I mean, maybe it's because, of course, religious motivations, but also because it was a special text. And this happened because it had this double turn. First, it's translated into English. Then, oh my God, this is so important. And then we can use it, And so this goes on. So you see, translation here is a very important problem. As I said, in order to develop self-identification. And of course, this was also the way for the Britishers in Europe to create the wonder that was India. Because what happens at this stage is that it's interesting because, we are using something that is only related to the past. India's present is totally erased. And for example, think of the judicial matters. You take something very ancient, you don't know what people do really in the villages. You don't ask people. I mean, when you have debates or something, who is deciding what kind of, laws do you have? No. You identify something that was there in the past. And so this kind of translation, if you think of what I was talking about in the first day, it's like, a way of promoting the notion that the translation is nowhere to be seen. Because we know that without the local pundits, the Britishers would have never translated one word. But do you know the names of these people? Very often it's translated by a native. A native. So it's like,
Example of someone who is working in this very university, Sadhana Nathani. She worked on a project of post-colonial folkloristics, where this colonial administrator named William Crook compiled folk tales from around North India through an interloper named Pandit Ram Garib Chaube. But it is very recently that people came to know about Ram Garib Chaube. People used to think of William Crook only.
Yeah. Because, of course, there is this racial aspect, Britishers were the ones to be seen. And then, the translator was not visible. The translation was something transparent, while we know that it was not like that. But, okay. So, I don't know if you are acquainted with Shakuntala, Vigyana Shakuntala, huh? That was, Kalidasa's drama, and it was translated into English by Sir William Jones in 1789. And this was a crucial translation because this traveled to Europe, and Goethe exalted it. And, for example, James Mill said, oh, this is very bad. But Europe discovered Sanskrit and the beauty of the wonder that was India, So what is interesting is that, I don't know if you know about what kind of translation is that. It's very nice because, of course, after this translation, okay, let me first explain to you. I don't know if you read it, if you know, but okay, I just give you an example. Shakuntala in English never sweats. Never. Because for an English woman is, that, how do they say? A man, a horse sweat, a man perspires, and a woman feels a little hot. So in this sort of situation, you have your heroine, it's the beauty of it, and she sweats? Oh, come on. That's, censorship, all the places where there are a lot of instances, and this was done because he was reading the text, he was also ignorant of another important fact. Being a scholar of literature, for me, this is very interesting, because, in the Sanskrit tradition, when a woman sweats, it has a meaning. It means sweating is sexual arousal. So if you cut it out, of course, your heroine will be very, I mean, you even give deodorant to her because, I mean, a woman doesn't have to perspire, but you're really cutting something that is very important from the literary point of view. I don't know, I don't think he was aware of that, but you see that the English Shakuntala, I mean, had some differences. Okay, let's just remain to this. But what is interesting is that the fact that Shakuntala was translated into English had an effect also in Indian languages, because in the 19th century, we suddenly have a lot of translation of Shakuntala from Sanskrit into Marathi, Hindi, Gujarati, and so on and so forth. Which means that, you know, there is, as I said, you know, there is always this sort of like circle. You have this translation, the translation is made for some purposes by the colonial people, but then it's appropriated by the local people, let's call them local people, Indians from all over India, you know, Maratha and whatever. And they use this translation for other purposes. And the purposes was to show that, look, somebody said that one shelf of a Western library is better than whatever has been written in India for thousands of years. But look, we have Shakuntala. So it's like, you know, speaking back, talking, like responding to them. And of course, another part of the translation story is the part regarding the Bible, and I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But of course, also that was useful to develop the vernacular, so-called, I'm using vernacular languages to use, you know, this idea of, you know, Indian languages and so on. And of course, in this aspect, the idea of equivalence came into play, because when you are translating a sacred text, the Bible, and you know, the missionaries were very keen for, you know, the fact that there must be equivalence. So you see, this is when the notion of equivalence comes into, let's call it, the Indian tradition of translation. Moreover, as I said, there was a standardization in Indian languages, because, you know, dictionaries, grammars, all these are created.
The translation of Gita, if you study at a Sanskrit department, so there is this very popular Gita in translation, that of ISKCON, the Krishna consciousness.
Oh yes, yes.
So they call it the Gita as it is in English, but a Sanskrit scholar will say call it Gita as it isn't for that translation.
Okay, because, you know, each and every tradition, religious tradition, has, you know, their own interpretation, but this is a different level, you know, because of course then you have, it's like, you know, having another commentary on the Gita, you know, which is done through translation. And of course, each and every sampradaya will claim that our tradition is the right one. So, I mean, so, but okay. Yes, but you know, ISKCON comes a little bit later in the. I mean, so I don't think it has to do with this first wave of, you know, translating into English and then going back into the local languages in India, because this English translation is like, you know, like prompting the notion that if we do translation, then we are like creating our identity and, you know, affirming our identity. This is what the point I wanted to make. So I want to give you the example of the Padmavat. Padmavat is a 16th century epic poem written by a Sufi poet, Malik Muhammad Jaisi, and manuscript that we have is in Persian script. So as I told you, you know, there is this Katha tradition that was there in many different languages and scripts, and Francesco Orsini has done a wonderful work on that. So if you want to know more about this, you know, different layers of Katha tradition, there is, I quoted her the image from. And of course it was written in Awadhi, but you know, Awadhi was written in Persian script. We also have later, let's say, translations or retelling of the story, because, you know, like the Bengali version that comes one century later is inspired by the Padmavat, but it's not the same thing, you know, but it's almost the same thing, yeah, with variation. What is interesting is that in the 19th century, and maybe for the French students this is important, you know, we have a translation into, anybody knew about this translation? I mean, it has a French avatar that is, I mean, quite old, because we are in the mid of the 19th century. We have Theodore Pavie, and he was like an Indologist, you know, somebody who was, you know, I told you there is this fashion of Sanskrit, and Sanskrit is the mother of all languages, and, you know, India is the cradle of all civilizations and all these things. And then we have this story, which is a kata, of course, because he reads it as, you know, a good example of this warrior spirit. And he speaks of that as the bards of Rajasthan and Hindu poets converted to Islamism have told with equal enthusiasm in the old idioms of the country as well as in Persian the history of this beautiful princess, daughter of the king of Ceylon and wife of the Rana of Chittor, who excited the covetousness of Sultan Alauddin. So this translation in French has a later avatar, which is an opera. You know what an opera is? You know, it's like, you know, this performance where you have a written text that is sung and put into the stage. And at the beginning of the 20th century, in 1922, the translation that was done in the middle of 19th century was like taken, adapted to an opera form, and it becomes a ballet opera with the title of Padmavati. So, what is important is that this story was seen as something interesting because it was an Indian history of, you know, the story of violence, desire, and sacrifice. So, if you think of that, we should think that Padmavat has had a great, I mean, success in becoming an important work in, let's call it world literature, because, I mean, come on, it was translated into French, it was made into an opera. So, but where is Padmavat to be seen in the European, let's say, history of world literature? It is nowhere to be seen. Even if we have this translation, it just, you know, it remains there in the English, in the Anglophone world. It's not mentioned. In India, we know that there were many recreations or translations, let's call them how we want, in several languages, and also Persian. And there is Srinivasan who wrote about that. But this work was not really recognized as literature, as an important work of literature, like Shakuntalam. And why? We know, by the way, that at that time there were many, many books from India circulating in Europe. Because, you know, for example, Francesco Orsini and Damrosch also, who, you know, they write about world literature. I mean, there are many, many books that were imported into Europe that circulated, but you know, in the critical, you know, the critics, आलोचनात्मक दृष्टिकोण से ये कोई अच्छी किताब नहीं होती है. तो so this makes us think, should put us to think about the fact that Padmavat that becomes Padmavati, it becomes it has a story of circulation in Europe, but to be recognized as literature, we need something more, because it was something that just happened and then disappeared. We can also see that even in South Asia, Padmavati, actually it's Padmavati, the Padmavati story. So it was there, but you can see that slowly, Jaisi is sort of forgotten. You know, everybody forgets about him. And the problem is, why should a Sufi poem, a Muslim, write in Hindi and not in Persian or Hindu? And tell us a story about Hindu Rajput heroes instead of talking about Muslims, Sultan of Delhi. Because, and here I have a quotation by Grierson, who was a very famous linguist. I don't know if you know him, but I mean, he is very famous, you know. And he's of what the Hindu mind can do when freed from the tremors of literary and religious customs. My point is that, you know, as I told you, the mental attitude was such that for colonial administrators, for Orientalists, you know, at that time, and we can see also, you know, what is imported in Europe, religion and caste were the categories of identity in South Asia. So, and Padmavat is problematic because it has the wrong script, the wrong author, you know, okay, it tells the right story, but, you know, if we see, Jaisi is always very keen of, you know, like telling us that this is not like only a love story, there is a different layer in the story and so on. And so, the Awadhi Sufi Malik Muhammad Jaisi is just forgotten. In fact, if we check what happened, Pavi's translation is not a translation of Jaisi's Padmavat, is the translation of another version of the Padmavat, that is Gora Badal Katha. That is almost the same story. So it's let's call it like a translation in this wider sense. That was, he identifies it as Rajasthani, because you remember it was written, it is like a Rajasthani poem and blah, blah, blah. But actually what was there was a Braj adaptation, and which was written in Lahore under Pathan patronage. So, but in the mind of the translator, this was the good thing. And for these people, okay, Jaisi, of course, must have been a Hindu converted to Islam. Otherwise, how can you write about a Hindu princess and blah, 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 blah? So you see that the notion of Rajput valor and so on cannot be ascribed to an author that is a Muslim, and Jatmal Nahar, he's more suitable to this because he's a Hindu. This is what happens in this, you know, set of translations, which is like, of course, I mean, in the end, is identified as, you know, the Padmavat, but it's, you know, very different. And of course, there is also the way then Padmavat was, let's say, retaken as the story of the Hindu resistance against the Muslim invasion. You know, so you see that there are so many things going into this story, and it's interesting because it's just one text. And then I would like to add one final thing, that of course we can see that if we see the world's literature, we find Kabir, Mirabai, Tulsidas, they are there, I mean, of the same time, you know, but Padmavat is nowhere to be seen. And the only modern, let's say contemporary translation into a European language that I found is an Italian translation made by my colleague Milanetti, who teaches in Rome. No other translation of Padmavat by Jaisi. Why that? In my opinion, it is because of this kind of selected reading of the text. Another important thing is that even in the Persian archive, we find a silence about something that in the 17th century, I mean, it was praised as an example of wonderful poetry, and Jaisi was hailed as the chief of the poets. But if we look at the Persian archive, very few local histories mention the Padmavat, and it's never mentioned in like biographical dictionaries of poets, of Sufi saints. And Francesca Orsini, who worked on this, I mean, she worked on this issue, she suggested that we need, and I agree, we need a different approach, because if we think that this ethno-religious and monolingual understanding of identity, language, literature, and script is, which is what we have, or I mean, we are studying Hindi literature as if it were something totally different from the Urdu literature. But we know that this is the result of a very recent history. And even the Manak Hindi that I studied is, I think its coinage is very, very recent. So if we use this kind of lens, the whole notion of translation is not to be seen, you know, because, I mean, we are thinking of separate worlds. We need a different approach. And I cannot prescribe what the right approach is, but of course it is what to, I will come back to this, trying to have different geographies and see, even the notion of multilingualism is not Hindi and Urdu and Bengali, it's this like very complex flux of languages and of texts in what we call translation, that are maybe not word-to-word translation, but they are like adaptation and, you know, rewriting of the text. So I don't know, should I stop here or can I just go on for a little bit? Okay. So yeah, very, very quickly, I would like also to say something about what I found about, you know, translation now, you know, let's come to the 20th century. We are just, you know, we're not doing the history of translation in India, you know, I'm just trying to see what happens in translation, you know, India and translation, you know, translation and India. So in independent India, what we see is that there is a process of institutionalization of translation. India is now a nation state. And, you know, the fact, well, there was the famous idea of, you know, unity in diversity and so on, but the necessity to create a literary awareness of all Indian literatures just, you know, made the government aware of the fact that this could happen through translation. As it was said, you know, translation is a bridge. So if we want to strengthen our nation, we have to create bridge among these different linguistic and cultural fields. So the establishment of the Sahitya Academy is a very important part of this project, because Of course, the officially accepted languages were there, but also other languages were added. What is interesting is that the linguistic policy is that everything passes through English. So there is no direct translation among Indian languages. The Sahitya Academy created a system where you have to go from Bodo to English and from English to Hindi, from Malayalam to English and from English to Bengali. So, I mean, you never have a direct translation. And I think yesterday we discussed how this can be somehow debatable. But this is what is there. In any case, the Indian literature, the Sahitya Academy Journal, says that Indian literature is one, though written in many languages, and so I mean it's one literature in many languages. So it's like saying that they are all the same. You know, when they are translated, they are all the same.
The origins of that actually lies in a project that was
Sorry.
The origins of this idea of one Indian literature of Sahitya Academy that you're talking about lies in a project that was taken up by Sri Kumar.
Yes, Sri Kumar Das. Yes, but I mean, I don't want to go into this story. I'm just trying to give you, some ideas of what happened, and yes, Sisir Kumar Das, he was really like proposing that there is only one Indian literature. And other people were claiming that there are many Indian literatures, but we are not discussing literature. We are just discussing the process of translation, the fact that translation becomes something that is commissioned by the government through institutionalized agencies, and the National Book Trust also. And then we can see that there are also like individual translators that take up the task of promoting translation. We will come back to Mahashweta Devi and the translation of Mahashweta Devi, of the translation of Mahashweta Devi's works by Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak. We will come back to this some other day, but this was like a person who decides that I will translation somehow, through my translation. Also, A.K. Ramanujan, I mean, he decided that, through translation, he would promote, for example, ancient Sangam literature. And this is something that we can discuss how we did it, if it's right or wrong, if we agree with this method or not. But, I mean, this is what happened. So, of course, slowly, the academic translation into English became very important, also because let's say that English was something that was very present in the institutions, like in universities, and it was important, the fact that translation studies, for example, developed in like comparative studies institutes and so on. So this, of course, is the reason why translation was into English. After the 80s, there are a lot of important reviews, like books, like the Book Review, the Indian Review of Books, that, of course, they are in English, but they translated or reviewed books that were also in other languages. And the fact that prizes for translation were created, of course, it gave impetus to the idea of translating. Today we see that there are very prominent publishing houses that are like, promoting translation from Indian languages into English. And also, I would say, I didn't write it, but because, there is also a lot of like interest in translating into Hindi, and some of the publishers are also like, getting interested in translating into other languages. But, for example, that was Rita Kothari here. She says, in one of her books, Translating India, the paucity of translation from one language into another is not an outcome of distribution and prominence available to English language activity are not available to regional language publishing. So here we bring into the picture another aspect that is not only the act of translating, the choice of the books, but also, the general field of publishers and distribution. And I don't know, maybe about Hindi, I think you know more than I do, because this is not my field. I don't know much about what is happening now about, the distribution for Hindi or other regional languages. But of course, we can see that the network of indie publishers is not as powerful as the network of English publishers. And so, I think this is valid also for other Indian languages. So maybe this is also one of the reasons why translations from Hindi to Marathi, or I don't know, maybe are not so common as, translation English to Hindi, Hindi to English, or something like that. Somebody was telling me also who are like really bilingual, that can, because here everybody is bilingual, but translating from one language to another requires the translator to have a good competence both in the source language and in the target language. And so sometimes the translators have a good competence in English and their own Indian language, or but they don't feel so comfortable in translating from in their Indian language into another Indian language. I don't know. Somebody was discussing with me about that, and I think maybe this is also part of the story. And the marketing of the so-called regional languages books. We know that what is considered high literature has a certain kind of market, and what's considered pulp literature has a different kind of market. So translations maybe are promoted in some fields and not in others. For example, I think that Rita Kothari wrote about the story of translation into Gujarati from English, and the circulation of this that were considered like pulp literature, but this is something that people would buy. But what kind of translation is that? Maybe somebody of you would like say, oh, this is not good translation, because the translation would not be faithful, it would not be equivalent, but this is something that still happens. And this is, I think, a general phenomenon that is changing, but there is the problem that translation is not considered a major activity, a major literary activity. And I'm talking about literary because this is what I do. It is either, if you are a translator and you are just like a commercial translator, then you're just, any machine could do your job. If you are a translator of literature, oh, come on, it's not such a good job. You're getting paid very low and very little. And so, this is probably another reason why not many people want to become translators. Or, a lot of people would like to become translators, but they would also like to have better payment conditions, and working conditions. I would like to finish with this notion of translation and recognition, because I was mentioning about the visibility of being translating into English, and the fact that it has a very important role in projecting both the translator and the writer, into the international sphere. I have the example of what happened to Gitanjali Shri. I have known her for many, many years before she was, Gitanjali Shri, and And I remember when Mai was translated. I think nobody knew about this writer and this novel until the English translation came out. And the English translation was made by not a professional translator, but a social anthropologist, because Nita Kumar is not a translator. Oh, well, she is a translator because she does translation, but her profession is being an anthropologist. So, and she chose this translation as a means to bring to attention of the audience feminist issues, the women's problems, women's fiction, and the translation itself. Because what is interesting in the English version of Mai is the so-called paratext, you know, so what is around the text. Because Nita Kumar writes and afterwards writes a whole explanation of what this translation means, puts this text into the history of anthropology, uses the story in order to show how it's about a mother, a very typical Indian mother, always silent and so on. And then, you know, how the daughter is like recovering the mother's voice. But at the same time, Nita Kumar is recovering her own voice and through this translation. So this is really very interesting. And of course, then in 2022, we have, you know, the Booker Prize and, you know, another example of what a translation can do. I remember when Red Samadhi came out, nobody gave a damn about that novel. Here in India, nobody was impressed by it. After it got the Booker Prize, everybody was like talking about Red Samadhi. And even in the West, you know, I mean, I'm talking about the West because it's like America and Australia and whatever. Now everybody wants to translate Red Samadhi. Daisy Rockwell is a wonderful translator, and she's like a star because you see. So this translation means to be translated, means to be recognized. But is this valid for all the languages? So I'm just giving you some examples. For sure, this is valid for English. And that's probably why I know many people who write and they hope that they will be translated into English. Or, you know, but this is not only in India, even in Italian, you know, Italian is like a minor language. We are at the periphery of the empire, you know, we are not America, we are not English speakers. Italian now has no prestige. So, I mean, so even young Italian writers, of course, they are keen to be translated into English. If you are translated into English, oh, come on, you have made it, you know. So, and this, of course, happened, as I said, to Mahashweta Devi. Mahashweta Devi didn't need to be translated into English in order to be a great writer. But when Spivak translated her, oh, everybody had to translate Mahashweta Devi in any language, you know. And also, for example, I'm quoting C.S. Lakshmi, who's a famous Tamil writer, and I mean, I've been writing for many years in Tamil, but it is only after I've been translated into English that I'm invited to forums like this. So being translated into English was actually a kind of promotion, because when you write only in Tamil, they assume that you don't have anything to state. So you see, you are, I mean, what you are writing is the same thing, but when it is translated, it has more value, it is more important, I don't know. So, of course, this tells us a lot about what I was telling you, you know, the mentality in the colonial time. It was linked to this colonial project, but even today, maybe we should think about what is called the intelligentsia, the Indian middle class, who are, you know, the people who speak in English, and, you know, the distinction between what is written in English and what is regional. This very division about, you know, what is regional I mean, regional, what does it mean? You know, it's like, I don't know, something that is not so important, that is like local, you know, it's something that is not speaking for everybody. So English is still projected as, you know, the field where you really have the national document. Even if there is a lot of, you know, talking about Hindi, and so on, but still, somebody was talking about, you know, the double aspect of Hindi. You know, we were discussing with somebody, you know, that Hindi is a language of power, of course, but it is also a subaltern language somehow. So you see, and in translation, of course, for some languages, being translated into Hindi is interesting. But think of what is happening, for example, for some, I'm thinking of like an experiment like Adivani, you know, it's like this publishing house that was promoting translation from Adivasi languages into English, not Hindi. And why that? Because Hindi, in certain context, is identified as the language of the government, you know, the nation state, that is the very problematic thing for many Adivasi communities. So there are all these things going on, and I think, of course, you know, this is really something that is a very important characteristic of the translation field in India, as I see it. You know, maybe you have different points of view. We can discuss on that now in the next minutes. But I wanted to finish just showing to everybody what Keshavji suggested. When was it? 2 days ago, first day. I don't. He suggested to us, and so I just wanted to share it with you, because this is a very interesting database, and I think it's really something that is promising for the future of Indian translation. I don't know how to say it. I mean, it's translation in India. I don't know, because it's like a depository of different translation in different languages, and maybe you want to go to this website, and it is written. I took what is written on the website. Bhashavad has noted a massive leap between the first 50 years of the 20th century, with 125 translations, and the first 20 years of the 21st century, with 2,673 translations. So the database is evolving and so on. And of course, there are languages that are more present, there are languages that are less represented, but the aim of this project is to create an even wider database. And another thing is that, you know, they are listing, you know, the authors that are translating, and interesting enough, of course, we have different publishers, and the authors are Rabindranath Tagore, Surat Chandra Chattopadhyay, Premchand, Amrita Pritam, William Shakespeare, Sadat Hasan Manto, Mahavita Devi, Jules Verne, and Satyajit Roy. So, I mean, this is just, you know, what I think you said it was established very recently. So I think
now it's maybe its establishment came before, but it was announced in November or December.
Yeah. So, but anyway, I think this is a good picture of what is going on now, as, you know, a project, big project for translation. And interestingly enough, it's coming from a private university. So, I mean, this is again something I was talking about, you know, the institutionalization of translation. So what is the translation policy of the Sahitya Academy? What is the translation policy, for example, of this project? I think it would be very interesting to compare these different approaches for people who study translation, of course. I'm not going to do it. So I will just shut up, and we have a few minutes if you want to discuss, ask questions. And
regarding the disparity in translation within Indian languages, but so regarding the disparity in translation, that you were saying that there is more translations and more prestige associated with translation in English. So there is this former professor in DU who wrote a paper about Chaturvarna system of languages, where he imagines languages in India within a Chaturvarna system, where Hindi and Sanskrit lies at the core, then come the scheduled languages, then come the non-scheduled languages, and thereafter the Adivasi languages, and where English is imagined outside the Chaturvarna system and has an emancipatory potential.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, that's also what, for example, there are some Dalit groups that claim that we should not stick to Hindi, we should just use English because, English is what will take us out of these fetters of, Hindi, which is identified somehow, with this Hindu system. Because, well, whether we like it or not, I mean, we can see that actually there has been a prevalence of Savarna people in Hindi studies, in Hindi academic world for a long time. Things are probably changing, but very slowly, and of course, this is like an ongoing process. So, yeah.
Also about the publishing and translation. There is something very interesting that I found recently when I visited the World Book Fair, where the traditionally English publishers like Penguin and Bloomsbury are venturing into publishing into Indian languages as well as translations within Indian language. Penguin had a stall called Penguin Swadeshi at the World Book Fair this time.
I think when Penguin started publishing Hindi books, that was really like a breaking thing. So just because you have talked a lot in these days, I would like other people to ask questions. Sorry, I don't want to censor anybody, but even if anybody has questions from home, I don't know, maybe from home, I mean from the online, wherever they are.
केशव जी और सभी साथियों, मैडम अलेसांद्रा जी, मारिना जी, ये मैं एक चीज मैं निवेदन करता हूँ आप सभी लोगों से। अंग्रेजी तो भारत में ऐसे ही गुलामी के दिनों की भाषा है और हम सारे ही लोग अब तक गुलाम हैं, क्योंकि हम इस अंग्रेजी के सुशोभनपन से मुक्त नहीं हुए। अभी एक वो देखा भी मित्रों से बात करते हुए, जो बात मैंने आज से 12 साल पहले जो बात की थी, उन्होंने शायद मैंने अपनी बात रखी और वो अपने लेख में डाल दिया और वो आ भी गई। अंग्रेजी का यही जलवा है कि मैं यार इसको जरा 1 मिनट के लिए बंद कर लूं। प्रसारण रोक दीजिए। प्रसारण एक मिनट।